Hey everybody, welcome to this episode of Thinking Christian. Today I am back with Alin Vrancila, again, my friend and colleague, and we're going to be we're going to have one more discussion, probably one more this round. I can't imagine Christian nationalism goes away, but we're going to have one more discussion about the neighborly faith study that came out December 2023. And one of the statements with which those who are classified as Christian nationalist adherents this time strongly disagree. And so the statement is this: religion has no place in government. That's the statement with which Christian nationalists heavily disagree, as opposed to any other group that this study sort of puts forth. So, Christian nationalist sympathizers, they are less than 25% in agreement with that statement, versus, let's say, Christian nationalist adherents are more than 50% in disagreement with that statement. And so you've got a pretty big spread, even just between the two groups who actually are closest on the survey, that they really, really disagree with religion has no place in government. So, unlike our previous episodes where we've really looked at the statements that Christian nationalists strongly agreed with, this time we're kind of flipping the script and saying, why is it that they would disagree so strongly with this statement? So, with that little introduction, I'll say, welcome, Alin. Thanks for being back, man.
Great to be back with you.
You're snowed in Portland, so I appreciate you taking the time. And
Best time to record a podcast when you're
that's
frozen and snowed in.
that's right. That's right. Um, any immediate thoughts about this? Again, you've had the opportunity to sort of grow up internationally, and so America and American politics isn't really your first language, let's say. And so when you think about the relationship between religion and government, what kind of thoughts do you have here that might be relevant for an audience that has largely been in the United States for most of its existence?
Uh, what I really appreciate about US, looking through a lens of the outsider insider. Somebody said that there's no such thing as a participant observer. You're either a participant or an observer. You can't be both, right? In this case, I think it's the unique cases in which I might be a participant observer, where I'm an outsider and I'm also observing. So there are a few things that I really appreciated about American politics or about all this. One is the Americans don't talk about politics, but they talk about politics, which is really interesting. So they
Yeah.
say publicly, we don't talk about politics, religion, and God in the public space, but in many ways they do. In many ways, right?
Yeah.
One, two, I really appreciate the fact that to this day I've seen a shift, which was concerning for me as an outsider, on the fact that there's no more debate and there's no more discussion, right? So the marketplace in America has almost removed the ability to have a conversation. Let's actually hash it out. Let's have a conversation. It's either a debate or it's actually a one-sided. You are a hater. You are this. That's it. There's no more conversation, no more dialogue. That is concerning to me, because I think many things about faith have to be discussed, and sometimes in the marketplace. I also love the fact that the Apostle Paul is one of the people that I look up to a lot in the teachings, was always in the marketplace, was always consumed with what is really happening in the marketplace. And he was not oblivious of Rome. He was not oblivious of Caesar. He really paid attention, because he knew at any given time changes in the marketplace would immediately impact faith. So, if a Caesar comes and says there's no more religion accepted in Rome, or Christians burn down Rome, all of a sudden you have a persecution of Christians in a matter of days. So I believe it's important. So when I look at religion in America, it is really different than almost any other place in the world. It's a unique place to have that. And the I'll start with the concerning, and then I'll go for positive. The concerning is the juxtaposition of the American culture with what faith is. One is saying that there's no such thing as an American, religion, like one, Christianity, even though the nationalists are claiming it to be, a Christian nation, and we talked about that. But there's no such thing as that. Although America, the American culture wants to blend in almost every faith in America and really capture it for itself. So that's the immediately that I can see as an outsider, some of the things that are happening, the discourse and some of the ways that are positioned in the area of blurring the lines between what's faith and what's actually a culture in America.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, man. I appreciate you bringing it out because I think that blurring of the line between church and state
Mhm,
is actually a biblical and theological problem. And
mhm,
so, if we can look at scripture and discern two separate entities, church and state,
mhm,
which I think we can. I mean, Romans 13, I think, makes it quite clear that there are governing authorities. That passage doesn't speak to state specifically, but there are governing authorities that God has appointed that are separate from the church. And the
mhm,
church is to have a specific sort of relationship with them based on the mutual um, uh, authority of God. So, in other
mhm,
words, because both sit under the authority of God, what Paul is telling the believers in Rome is he's saying, look, the state is under God's authority, you're under God's authority, you're obeying God when you're obeying the state. Now,
mhm.
ultimately, when the state doesn't obey God, you're still obeying God. And so that can create friction and rub, right? But I think the state is not the church and the church is not the state.
Yes.
Now, I think one of the interesting things that sort of again blurs that line between the two, and when we're looking at this statement, it's really specifically about religion. And so there's
Mhm,
something to be said about the distinction between church and state. There's another thing to be said, I think, about religion and the state.
mhm.
So if we look at something like First Amendment, we have the Establishment Clause or the prohibition of the establishment of religion by the state, and then the free exercise of religion. Um, what I find fascinating is that that clause doesn't preclude the state from doing religious sorts of things. And so even though they couldn't point to, let's say, your Southern Baptist church down the street and say, we're establishing this as the national church, the United States can use and leverage religious language. It can pull in ceremony and ritual, and it can, in essence, create a civil religion. This is something that goes all the way back to like Rousseau. He posited that the government needed to have some sort of civil religion that would be broadly tolerant of almost any sort of belief system and would allow the governing authorities not to be subject to the clerics. And so, in other words, he didn't want the church to trump the state. He wanted the state to remain in charge. And to do that, he felt that there needed to be some sort of broad consensus about specific theological topics that would be sufficiently broad to cover all the world religions but not necessarily preclude the exercise of those religions. Now, Rousseau was interesting because he also said that religious tolerance was necessary. In other words, religions had to tolerate, right, what was going on with other religions. So
Yes.
as we look at this today, Christianity is an exclusive religion. And what I mean when I say that is that we believe that it's not that we just believe it. It's that God has revealed to us that the reality is the Bible
Mhm,
is the authority, that Christ is the only way, and that all these other ways are providing false hope, that they are providing false teachings, and
mhm,
that Christianity is the only religion. Now, we are not militant about that,
mhm,
which I think is part of what Rousseau was concerned with. He didn't want one religion to be so militant that they started to try to take over and coerce people into behaving in a manner that was commensurate with their religion, as opposed to persuading them to come over to the side of their religion, right? That's a big difference. And so, the separation of religion and government I think it is sort of problematic as we look at it because what you have is established religions, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Judaism, all those sort of established religions Then you also have what I would call secular ideologies, right? We've seen a number of writers argue that things like critical race theory
Mhm,
or the whole woke movement is religion-esque or
mhm,
sufficiently analogous to religion that we might as well treat it like a religion, but it's not officially recognized as a world religion.
mhm,
And then you also have civil religion, which we most often ignore.
mhm,
We sort of leave that one alone because it feels very innocuous,
mhm,
right? And it feels accommodating of all faiths. And so when something is accommodating of all faiths, it doesn't feel like an enemy of any of those faiths. But the
mhm,
reality is, it kind of is.
mhm.
So, yeah, any thoughts or comments on that?
Yes, I have a few observations. I actually really appreciate the excursion through the history of US, because I do think US, even though it's a relatively new country. I mean,
Yeah.
250 years. I mentioned this. My hometown is from the 1500s. I spent some time in England, and when you are there, it's fascinating that you get a sense that England is an old wise person, and America is a teenager, and they treat it like that. Like America is like, oh, basically the attitude is like, we've done that. You'll grow out of it, right? We've
Right.
experienced that. But in
Yeah.
many cases, America has done things that are unprecedented, and it's the reason that it's called the greatest experiment, because it's done some things in the way that it's created a space. Somebody gave an example of how the socialism in Scandinavia and Norway is a good example of
Yeah.
something that America should thrive for. And I argued significantly the fact that America is unprecedented because it has 192 nations living together with, I think, 192 religions coexisting in a way that is unprecedented, because in Norway you have 5 million people that are basically of the same belief mostly, and even then sometimes they have a hard time. So how do you do it?
Yeah.
In When I lived in Chicago, I was in a building apartment that had 400 apartments, and I think all the 192 nations were represented in that building, right? And you learn how to actually uh, coexist really well. But learning the history of how America has had to learn about some things and put some things in place is really powerful. What I think it's one observation that I have when you talk, I love the first you argued the idea of religion. What is religion? And if you go for how misunderstood it is, so when a Christian nationalist that identifies himself as a Christian nationalist and then answers a survey, when they make the statement, I want religion to actually have a significant place in the government, I'm quite certain they mean Christianity. And they're not thinking religion, right? There was a conference one time on religious freedom, and somebody made the observation, you're here because you want Christianity freedom, right? Not religion. Because if you truly want religious freedom, that would bother you that Buddhists next to you, the Islam next to you, would have the same religious rights and you would have right next to you in America. But they're not fully wrong, being very careful with the statement, because my understanding is that the world religion has a Christianity origin. And it initially meant, and Augustine, I think, argues with this hardly, and says he was bothered by the use of the word religion, because initially religion meant the worshiping of God, basically a Christian God. But then it was used mostly for social relationships. And when people were using religion, they were using it mostly for social relationships. And I found that interesting that the word has evolved now all the way to millennials and Gen Zs. It would be interesting to see if there's such a thing as a Christian nationalist Gen Z, right? And we need to explore, are there any such things as Christian nationalist millennials or Gen Zs? But I think when you ask a Christian nationalist Gen Z or a Gen Z about religion, they're fundamentally opposed to the concept. And church now, even the separation of church and state, I think there's a separation of church and generations. Gen Zs, and even starting with millennials, they're having a hard time really identifying with what the church is trying to do in the marketplace and in the space. So it'd be very curious to know, even from your perspective, how do you feel like we even define what a Christian nationalist is saying religion has to have an important role. Are they meaning Christianity? And if that's the case, that would make sense. That statement would make sense from a Christian nationalist perspective.
Uh, I mean, I think within the Christian nationalist framework, you have to assume that they mean Christianity. And I think we have to read this statement in relation to some of the other statements that are correlated with what it means to be a Christian national adherent, which include, the true culture of the United States is fundamentally Christian. The federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation. Even things like public schools should allow teachers and coaches to lead or encourage students in Christian prayer. Even just that qualifier of Christian prayer, I think is really important. And so, yes, I believe that when we're looking at this statement, what people who are answering the survey have in mind, it almost has to be Christianity. Where I would tend to, where I would tend to take some exception to this is that, two things. Number one, if people think that Christianity should be involved in the government, there are mechanisms for Christianity to be involved in the government, right? You can have Christians in office. Yes. You can elect them. You can advocate for Christian policies, let's say. And I use that term very loosely. By what I mean by that is policies with which Christians would see an alignment between the policy and some biblical teaching. Right. So we've got the easy ones like no abortion. I've said before, Roe v. Wade was not good. Dobbs v. Jackson is not any better. It's a political compromise, and we can't pass that off as Christian. At most, it's conservative. It's certainly not Christian, because all it does is it changes the governance structure that determines whether or not abortion is legal. It does not prohibit abortion. And so in those cases, what we're seeing there is we're seeing not a Christian instantiation of policy, right? We're seeing a policy that might move, we think, maybe in the right direction, right? Because some states are going to ban it altogether, or some states are going to curtail certain practices or what have you. But it is still not a Christian decision, because the Christian decision, and the only Christian decision, is no abortion. So we've got to be careful with that language. But I think the idea of having religion involved in government here, what I would say the danger in my mind is that in joining forces with the state, when religion joins forces with the state, I have my doubts that the church is capable then of playing a different game. So let me explain it like this. We've all played Monopoly, probably. Like, Monopoly is a fairly popular board game. And it doesn't matter whether you choose the thimble or the car as your game piece, right? The gameplay isn't affected by whether you are the car or the thimble. You're still playing Monopoly.
Yes.
And so once you decide to play Monopoly, it doesn't matter whether you're the car or the thimble. Now, the choices that you make while you're playing Monopoly are all within the context of Monopoly, right? Do I want to get the light blue properties that are really cheap and put hotels on them super fast but make less money? Or do I want to make the bet of trying to get the green properties on the other side of the board and Boardwalk Park Place, so that if somebody lands on them, they're almost automatically bankrupt? Those are just choices, but they're all within the context of the same game. And so what I would argue is that when we're trying to weave religion into the state, what we're doing is we're denying religion the opportunity, and specifically Christianity the opportunity, to play an alternative game. We're forcing the church to play Monopoly when it could be playing chess or Catan or whatever, right?
Yes.
Instead, it's like, nope, the church needs to pull in and play Monopoly with the state. And I just think there's a lot of problems with that, because if we're thinking about it from a discipleship perspective, discipleship is to hone our senses so that we see the world differently. We hear the world differently. We experience the world differently. And if all that difference is going to entail is whether or not we buy the light blue properties or Boardwalk Park Place, I don't see what the big deal is. That's not a huge alternative. That's just
Yes.
a different strategy playing the same game. And that is
Mhm.
not what the church is. The church is something more distinct than that. We are playing a completely different game. I think this is why in Ephesians 6, Paul says, we do not wrestle against flesh and blood.
Mhm.
We wrestle against the powers and principalities and spiritual realms. That is a different game.
Mhm.
That's not a different strategy. It's a different
Mhm.
game. And
Yes.
so that to me is where some of this runs aground.
Mhm.
And part of the reason it's uncompelling, to get back to your comment about Gen Z, I think part of the reason it's uncompelling to younger generations is because all they see is the choice between the car and the thimble.
Yes.
So who
Yes.
cares?
Mhm.
Give me the thimble, give me the car. We're all playing the same game. In other
Yes.
words, we've made it so that religion doesn't matter.
Yes. Yes.
At the very least, it doesn't
It's a
matter,
yesterday thing.
yeah, in such a significant way or a sufficient way that it would be compelling to people,
Mhm.
right? And so if I can hold conservative beliefs and not worry about going to church on Sundays, why wouldn't I?
Mhm.
It
Mhm.
seems like an unnecessary trip. And so I think the church just has some work to do here. But this statement, religion has no place in government, I would actually tend to be in
Mhm.
stronger agreement than disagreement with it.
Mhm.
Not in the sense that I think Christians shouldn't participate in government. I don't have any issue with Christians holding office. I don't have any issues with Christian voting or any of that, right? But I do think that the two realms, in order to remain distinct, religion cannot play the political game on the world's terms. And I think that's a crucial point, on the
Yes.
world's terms. If we're playing
Yes.
on the world's terms, we're really
Mhm.
no longer the church,
Mhm.
because the church does not play games on anyone else's terms other than God's. It makes us disagreeable people, kind, compassionate, all of those different things, but also very disagreeable. We're going to
Yes.
rub against people. And that's what
Mhm.
I think it means to be salt and light.
Yes.
So,
There,
yeah,
there's
that's
the
how I think
reason.
about it.
There's a reason the largest church in the world is underground in China, because there's a point to which they tell the government that is killing that killed 50 million people actually, right? To that government, they're saying, yeah, but we're gonna stay with Jesus. Like there's a limit to which we're not going to really abide by the government's the state religion, all that, because we really love Jesus. There's power there. I want to make two observations here, because these conversations are really important. They're important to me, but I think they're important for a whole generation, and important for somebody that is really thinking through their own wrestling with these concepts. Can we move the conversation forward? One is the matter of the longest chapter in the book of John chapter 6. It's like verse 68. Something happens over there. It's fascinating to me, where Jesus has 70 disciples and he starts talking all kinds of things. And he's saying, you need to drink my blood, you have to eat my flesh. And all those people were like, you know what? Double tap, we're out of here. Like this is too much. And then he turns to the 12 and he was like, aren't you going? And Peter looks at him and was like, where? And Peter makes a statement which is very powerful, because in that moment, everything that Peter would have done through the remaining of his life, I think it's absolved just by the statement that is made. It's like, where would we go? You have the words of eternal life. And then he said, we have come to believe, we have actually come to the realization, to the belief that you are from God, that you are God. And putting that in perspective is to hold that belief as a Christian, that basically Jesus has the words of eternal life. In another place in the New Testament, it says he spoke like one that had power. We are sometimes either drunk or afraid of power. There's drunk with power, afraid of power. And yet, you mentioned in the previous podcast, we talked about government and the role of government and all that, and I highly recommend that discussion. that Jesus said, I have the authority, the entire authority was given to me, right? When I think it's such a minimizing factor to really try to shove religion and Christianity into government like it fits there. And if you do that, you give it legitimacy,
Right.
right? It's such a minimizing of even Peter's broken understanding of the fact that Jesus has the words of eternal life. That basically in him you'll find something that you don't find in the Monopoly game. That no good political speech, doesn't matter how great it is, comes anywhere close to that. And I'll make a second observation with your permission. For me, I got stuck and I constantly go back to John chapter 3. Out of that conversation, and this is one of the things that I love about our theology of worship, comes from Jesus talking to a woman at the well. Our theology of salvation comes from Jesus talking to a Pharisee named Nicodemus, having a late night conversation. And from that, we have John 3:16 tattooed on our faces in the game day, and being the number one verse in the world, translated everywhere, from one late night conversation that Jesus had with Nicodemus. But that conversation is fascinating to me, and it ties directly into what we talk about today. Because Nicodemus comes to Jesus late at night in a time when it was the highest, I would say, if you look in the history of the world, the highest human experience in three areas. You have the highest human experience in terms of the temple, the religiousness. I don't think there's ever been a more complex temple than the Jewish temple. So the religious aspect of it, the highest game. You have the Roman Empire, which has never, I don't think there's ever been a more robust empire than the Roman Empire in terms of organization, glory, the glory of Rome, all that craziness. And you have the highest form of philosophy right now in America and all the world. We still study the philosophers that are contemporary or just a little bit about around Jesus's time. So Nicodemus is sitting at the foothill of the largest, most complex empire in the world and form of government in the world. America still organized like the Roman Empire to this day. He's sitting at the foot of the temple, the most complex religious system ever known to humanity, and he's sitting on the foothill of the philosophy, the highest form of philosophy. We still teach our children right now about Plato and about all those guys. And yet he's saying, not enough. He comes out at night and comes to Jesus and I was like, I have some questions. And he becomes such a devout religious person. We found him again buying Jesus's tomb, basically sacrificing himself. So for me, looking at what the world has to offer, what the governments, what the philosophy, what all these have to offer, they really truly pale in comparison with what Jesus has to offer when you actually fully fully dedicate yourself to the kingdom.
Yeah, it's an important point because I think it's really important point because number one, I've said this before, Christians are the only people who can proclaim the gospel. And so if we start to dilute that message, we really do short what we're doing for the world. And I think this is something that many Christians may not think through 100%. But what I would say is when we're building up the body of Christ, when we are becoming disciples, right, strengthening our own spiritual growth, that is to some degree for us. It's for the church. It's to glorify God. It's all those things. It's also for the world's sake.
Yes.
And I think that's the part we miss. That us becoming the church, us becoming more the church, becoming increasingly conformed to the image of Christ is not simply something that benefits us. It's actually for the world. The world needs to see it.
Yes. Yes.
And so to tie ourselves in to what God has established, an appropriate thing that God has established. The state is not trivial. Right. I don't think I don't want people to hear us saying that. The state isn't trivial.
Not at all.
It's absolutely crucial. God has established it for a very particular purpose. I just happen to think that we often expand the scope of the state
Mhm.
beyond what God has intended.
Mhm.
And so God has given it a certain degree of authority, and we tend to do this. We say, well, if God has given it this authority, then we need to expand that authority and give it this amount of authority. And it's like, no, if God's given it this amount of authority, that's the amount of authority it has. And so why are we
Mhm.
giving it more? And
Yes.
so the point is the state has its place. Those governing authorities have their place,
Mhm.
but their place is not in the church. And I don't think that the
Mhm.
church's place is with necessarily the governing authorities.
Mhm.
And again, when I say that, I'm not saying Christians shouldn't participate in government. What I am saying is that when we start to mix and intermingle those two categories, church and state, church and religion, we get into some very sticky problems that I don't really think we want to get into. And so I think the other side of that, Aline, the other thing I would say to your comments is, um, Philippians, or not Philippians, I'm sorry, Ephesians 2:12 through about 19. Um, 1 Peter 2, right? Specifically 2:9. You have this piling up of political terms that are then applied to the church,
Mhm.
right? Peter calls the church a chosen nation, or a chosen race, a holy nation, a people of God's own possession, right? Ephesians 2 talks about the separation of the Gentiles from the commonwealth of Israel and the engrafting in of the Gentiles so that they are now citizens alongside God's chosen people, and that they have become not only citizens, but also members of the household of the oikonomia of God. And that phrase household is not like I live in a house, right? The household was considered sort of not exactly a political unit, but it wasn't exactly just a family either.
Mhm.
And so what we're seeing is, I think, this piling up of terms with regard to the church, that the church is in and of itself a political entity. And that as we're exercising Christ's authority, not
Mhm.
again through the political means of the world, but through discipleship, what we are
Mhm.
doing and what we're trying to do is draw people out of, it's very similar, like I've come to think of it like the call of Abraham. Abraham is in a settled nation and God calls him to sojourn, right? Trust me, come away from your established land and sojourn with me. We have a very similar call to non-Christians. We're saying, look, we know you think you're part of this American system. Come sojourn with us. We're not actually part of that system, right? Come sojourn with us. Come be a part of our community. Come be a part of our political community. And again, in saying that, I think the real root problem of some of the Christian nationalism that I'm seeing is that it has a militance to it. And to me, Christianity is not about militance, it's about martyrdom. We are to be faithful to God even when the consequences mean death.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so Christian nationalism seems like what it wants is it wants to shift the power around a little bit so
Mhm.
that Christians or people who believe the same thing as Christian nationalists,
Mhm.
right, are now in charge and can order society such that, and my sort of tongue-in-cheek way of putting this is so that we can be comfortable with the sinfulness of the world, right? We're uncomfortable with abortion, but we may not be so uncomfortable with greed, right? And so let's maximize the economy, but eliminate abortion, right? Well,
Mhm.
I mean,
Yes.
on some level, I like if we could get rid
Mhm.
of all abortion, great, fine. Maybe I would live with greed, but I'm not sure that that's the end goal that we should be shooting for,
Right.
right? It suggests an ordering of loves, which I think is an appropriate thing, right? But it doesn't suggest an end,
Mhm.
right? Our utopian dream cannot be in ceasing prosperity through capitalist economics, but no abortion.
Mhm.
Right? That's the wrong utopia. Right. And so and that's not a shot at capitalism at all, right? It's to underscore a point that the church is not that.
Mhm.
And the kingdom of heaven is not that. And
It's not
so
that.
when we depend on those mechanisms to lead us to the promised land, we are inevitably
Mhm.
not going to end up in the promised land that we are anticipating. Right? The
Mhm.
only way into the promised land is to follow Jesus. He is not only the source of our salvation, he is the way, the truth, and the life. The way,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? In the way that he lived, so must we live.
Yes. Yes.
And so there's a discipline and a discipleship
Mhm.
that is required for us to live as Jesus lived.
Mhm.
So that's sort of my thoughts on this. I think, as we consider religion involved in government, that is my big concern, I think, is that all of a sudden, where maybe the intention is for government to serve religion or to sit underneath, the authority of religion, for religion to call balls and strikes on, let's say, moral issues or issues of justice and things like that. What I tend to see happen is that religion will be corrupted by state concerns, because
Mhm.
the state has no real choice but to be anxious about what people will wear and what people will eat. Whereas Christians are called not to be anxious about those things, but to seek first the kingdom
Yes.
of God and his righteousness. And so there
Yes.
is a mismatch here. And
Mhm.
again, not to trivialize the state, God has established it for a reason, but it's different. And
Yes.
so pulling these two things that are very different together and suggesting a fusion between them, I think is
Mhm.
way wrongheaded.
I agree strongly. So I often refer to the Roman Empire, and I know it sounds like
Yeah.
I'm a broken record, but I do because I'm Romanian and we come from the Romans. We got we got taken over by the Roman Empire 2,000 some years ago. So, but there's a strong lesson to be learned. There's a strong lesson to be learned. So the Roman Empire, in 313, the Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, which accepted Christianity and made Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire. What's fascinating to me is that that move is attributed to the fall of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, really conflating the two of Christianity and the empire. It's one is deemed to destroy the other if you actually put them on top of each other.
Yeah.
One is deemed to swallow and completely devour the other one. And that's why our conversation does take a dimension of importance and reality on the fact that are we comfortable with the concept that when we actually want religion and government to actually be mingled in such a way that you can't untangle them, one will devour the other, that one will actually eat the power of the other, right?
Yeah.
What's fascinating to me is that, so you have 313, but in 380, the Emperor Theodosius issued the Edict of Thessalonica, which made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Christianity, the
Mm.
official religion. What I
Yeah.
loved about that move, so they said Christianity is the official religion, but the Nicene Christianity, and they immediately named heretics everybody that was not Nicene in their
Right.
approach, and started taking their properties and actually like killing people who were not, and they were deemed heretics.
Yeah.
So now with the newfound power, right, with the new devoured power, they're saying whoever's not this flavor of religion is outside of the state.
Yeah.
What a massive problem, right?
Yeah.
I don't think we're far removed from that reality in America. If this becomes ever a reality where America will actually accept a type of religion to be the religion of state, besides civil religion,
Yeah.
I would really be concerned about everybody else.
Well, I think you're probably right to be concerned about everybody else because I think in the best instances, you have, let's say, Constantine and Charlemagne, who also within the history of the world have sort of proclaimed a Christian empire.
Hmm.
And I think the best reading, the most generous reading of what they did is that they helped to facilitate the flourishing of the church, right? Instead of mandating,
Hmm.
coercing people to be Christian, they tried to
Hmm.
clear space. And again, this is the most generous reading, I think. They tried to clear space to allow the church to flourish. And,
Yes.
to some degree, I think that's an appropriate way of thinking about part of what the state could do.
Hmm.
Is that, maybe instead of, voting along party lines and issues and those kind of things, maybe what we should be thinking about is, or at least one of the things we should be thinking about is how does a particular political regime position itself vis-a-vis the church?
Hmm.
Um, that said, I think that right now what we're sitting in is a polarized environment
Hmm.
where people are either right or wrong. There isn't a lot of room
Yeah.
for gray areas. And so it does seem to lend itself to this moment where you're either right or wrong. You're either going to be on the wrong side of history or on the right side of history. And there's going to be some sort of arbitrary tribunal of people. And I don't
Mhm.
really care. I mean, I could be on that tribunal and I would still think it was a bad idea. Right. um,
Yes. Yeah.
because I think anyone who sits above and tries to decide and call balls and strikes on what is and what is not appropriate and maybe heretical versus orthodox, we're
Hmm.
entering into a new situation where the coercive power of the state is now combined with a religious force and authority. And in combining those two, what you get is a monster.
Hmm.
You get
Hmm.
basically the worst parts of Revelation.
Yes. Yes.
And so, you think through Revelation 12 and 13, right, where you have the two beasts, and the second beast forces people to bow down to the first beast.
Hmm.
This is, I think, in my reading of Revelation,
Hmm.
the odd combination of civil and religious authority.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so, we want to be careful how we think about these issues. I don't know that people are sitting back, twisting their mustaches and petting their cats, and trying to be evil about all of this. But I think that good intentions often
Hmm.
pave the way to really negative consequences, and we should be consulting the Word of God, trying to understand it as well as possible,
Hmm.
recognizing, I think, that the church and the state are really, truly separate entities, whether we want to combine them or not.
Hmm.
The church and the
Yeah.
state are always going to be separate because God has established them as such.
As such.
And so,
Yes.
in reality, they are separate. In our
Hmm.
experience, we may try to merge them.
Hmm.
That's our mistake. And
Yes.
I think that'll have
Yes.
problems. So ultimately, I think, maybe
Yes.
we're probably agreeing. It sounds
Hmm.
like we're agreeing that, religion, if we're thinking about this statement, religion has no place in government. Would you agree, Aline, that if we rephrase this to say, um, religion has no voice with government? In other words, religion should have no influence over government, that we would both disagree with that.
Yes. Also, I would say the government is filled with religious people
Yeah. And I think
because you
that's
can't
really, yeah.
separate. Yes.
Yeah.
You
I
can't
think,
separate the fact that that is the reality. The government is a form of people.
right. And I think
When we
that's
talk about
really
religion,
the,
yes.
I think that's really the kicker here is that, if we think about it in terms of should religion have some sort of a voice with the government? Should it have the ability to speak truth to power? Obviously,
Hmm.
right? I mean, I think we can,
Yes.
you
Of
know, that is something that we can agree with.
hmm.
But I would also say, sort of, and this is
Yeah.
to project, we're going to do some we're going to have some folks on who are familiar with the Barmen Declaration that the confessing church made during World War II when the German evangelical church sided with the Nazis. The confessing church came along and wrote up the Barmen Confession and basically said, no, we really can't endorse the Nazis because we're the church and that means something. And I think that where we're at with Christian nationalism is something of a similar place. And I'm not comparing Christian nationalists to Nazis. Don't hear me saying that. But this sort of merger and fusion of the church and state is oddly similar to what the Barmen Declaration was addressing, which is basically saying nothing about the atrocities of Nazi Germany. They were simply saying something about the atrocity of the church fusing with government and setting aside its God-given responsibilities as church.
Yes, yes, and it doesn't have to be ending up into a genocide or into a Holocaust.
Correct.
But it's still already detrimental to a point that we really will never see the side effects of doing that.
That's
the ripple
right.
effects don't end at the core. Yes.
Well, very good, man. I think we've kind of addressed this statement. Religion has no place in government, with which many Christian nationalist adherents disagreed. What I would say is that I tend to agree with it, with the qualification that religion needs to have a place to speak to government, almost a prophetic function that calls government and reminds government, both in word and deed. I think in its very presence, it reminds government that it is under God's authority and that everything it's doing is provisional, temporal, and that it is really incapable and ultimately not called to address some of those deeper spiritual issues. That is the realm of the church. And so
yes, I fully agree with that.
So as we kind of close out these discussions, this will be the last of the discussions we do on the Neighborly Faith Report. I just think, overall, where I stand with Christian nationalism is there can't really truly be to suggest that there should be a fusion between church and state is to deny the institutions that God has established.
Yes.
I think that if the church is going to influence, I think if the church is going to influence American government, it has to do that as the church, as separate from the American government. But as citizens in a democracy, we certainly have the opportunity, right? And I think it is appropriate for us to think about how we participate in that American democracy. But I think as we'll discuss a little bit in different episodes later, I would argue that decision-making process, as to go back to an analogy we used, shouldn't take place on the Monopoly board. It should take place before we decide to play Monopoly.
Yes, I agree. This was a great journey for me, also a journey of discovery. I'm very thankful for these conversations, and as I learn even more and as I observe more about what does it mean to be an American, what does it mean to be a Christian, and what does it mean to be a Christian in America. But one thing that I appreciated is, what's the foundation from which I sit? Am I a Christian getting involved in religious aspects, or am I an American actually, like, what's first? What is the foundation from which I analyze things?
Yeah.
So thank you for this conversation.
Yeah, we're always, I think we can leave the conversation here. We are always Christian first.
Yes.
Always Christian first. If we're going to be disciples of Christ, we have to be Christian first. And that really does mean that we think about these things differently than just along red or blue political lines. So
and empires come and go.
That's right. Well, thanks, Alin, for being part of these conversations, and thanks y'all for listening. Hopefully you come back for the next episode of Thinking Christian, and check out our website, usefultogod.com. That's usefultogod.com. There's other resources and things there that you can check out. And also check out my forthcoming book. I've got a book coming out called Serpents and Doves, and it covers a lot of the ground that we're talking about today. It's on Christians, politics, and bearing witness in the world. And so I just encourage you to check out that book. It should be out by February. So
Ooh,
take a look
that's
for that.
exciting.
Yeah. But until the next episode, have fun, enjoy life, and don't go insane over U.S. politics. Take care, everybody.
Have a good one.